Dr Njoki Ngumi. I work with the Nest Collective. We've done a bunch of work just kind of exploring the whole thought of object return that kind of starts situating the object as a placeholder or as a symbol for the amount of power and the number of items beyond objects that actually do need to change hands quite urgently. And we are very proud to hold space for our ancestors who started this conversation decades ago. We're not the first Africans to ask for our things back. We will not be the last ones, but we intend to continue speaking loudly while we can.
All right. Welcome, Daktari.
Thank you very much. My name is Lydia Muthuma. I'm actually honored to be here. And I'm one of those people who'd rather live and let live. But when we are discussing matters identity, it's difficult to say live and let live because it's me who's involved. So I have tried to ignore that question, and I've been trying in vain. I must get involved. I don't have a choice. So thank you for inviting me here today, and I hope I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion.
Welcome, Daktari. Welcome.
Hello. I'm Jambo. My name is Njeri Gachihi. I work for the National Museums of Kenya, and it's really an honor to be here this afternoon. I work as a research scientist, doing different things here and there, but for some reason I kind of stumbled upon this subject that I wouldn't have wanted to be involved in, but as my fellow panelists have said, I couldn't avoid it, and I have been part of this community that is trying to speak and think like our forefathers would have thought. Just to quote Daktari's words, we don't know exactly what they would have wanted to see, but we are trying to see if we can even just say 10% of what that would be. Thank you very much, and welcome.
Welcome, Jerry. I actually read your article in this issue on the Dome. I hope I'm pronouncing it properly, Dome. And it was very fascinating, and I would encourage everyone to read it. Someone is laughing at me because I'm probably not pronouncing it very well. But that brings us to our first question. Why restitution? Why restitution? This is okay. We can start with Dr. Njoki. Why restitution? Why should these things, these objects, these our people, why should they be returned?
So first of all, there's a lot of room for nuance in this long overdue conversation. The first is that we do have to recognize that not every single African object and this is not me doing not all objects, that's not what's going on. But in honesty, not every single African object in a museum abroad left by nefarious means, right? Not every single one of those objects is desired back home. There are some that are very specific that are desired home. The second thing is that it's not just objects we want. There's a veritable ocean of colonial records that detail the deaths of families. People might be there by name, people might be there by location, certain wrongs that were done to people over certain periods of time, so that then we can begin to ask properly for restitutionary action, which can be anything from reparations to some sort of formal recognition of the wrong done. We're also very aware, of course, as Africans, that a lot of these colonial records were destroyed. I think also the other thing to note is that a lot of times people want to focus on the back and forth of the object actually moving. And there's a lot of politics in the objects moving, and it would be great to hear Njeri talk about it because she's much more familiar with the museum context and like the nonsense involved in trying to move an object. An object belongs to the museum, but the museum is an entity in trust to another thing, some sort of government, a thing like that. So the object technically is held by the museum, but does not necessarily belong directly to the museum. And so for an object to then move, there's a lot of paperwork that will need to be pushed, which tells you that the objects were actually transferred to be live prisoners. They were never intended to come back home because the process was designed to lock them at their final destination. So for us to come and say we do not want those objects there is us coming to say we need to commute this life imprisonment, which of course even for a person is a long process, right? And that this is why our ancestors in the decades before colonization and after started to have this conversation and continued to push it forward. So now, when you put all of those things together, it becomes important that in order for there to be any remote attempt at a sort of understanding of how we sit when it comes to power, because in any other context, if I came to you and I told you that sweater you're wearing actually was taken from me, and there's proof, there could even be documentation of the story, and then in any other context, if we consider ourselves to be equal human beings, you would say, oh, this is terrible to hear. What do we do now? Because it's like, okay, now we have to talk about what happens when you're not wearing a sweater. And then I might tell you, actually, that's not my business. The sweater is mine, and I've come for it, right? Or the conversation about, so you'll be cold, what does that mean for you? If I'm feeling gentle, or, but that would require me to want to be part of that conversation. But truly, I only have to engage until the place of that's my sweater. In any other context, if we were equal, it would be easy for you to give me back my sweater. But in the context we are in now, and even a child in a playground can tell you what Africans are saying, give us back our objects, our records, our everything to do with us, give it back. And people are saying, we can't, I don't know, it was such a long time ago, why can't you guys just forget, just make a new one? That conversation is proof of a power dynamic that is toxic and that is unjust. For the justice alone, it's important to have conversations about the restitution of objects, and that it must move beyond conversation, because we've been at conversation for the last several decades.
For a very long time, yes.
Exactly.
You've raised a very interesting question, and I would like to pose this to Lydia, where the sweater analogy, assuming you have evidence and you have paperwork, I have taken the sweater. But in some of these instances where we are demanding some of these objects to come back, that were taken from countries that didn't even exist before, like if you talk about the Benin bronzes, they didn't necessarily belong to the country Benin. So what happens where we are having this conversation, these objects were taken, and at times I think we're being polite when we say taken, that the correct word is stolen, looted, there was thievery, there was robbery and theft. What happens when these, because I think there's a word for it, I think it's provenance, that, there's a root, there's evidence. What happens when there's no evidence, but then it's clear that this object does not belong in this country, in this museum? What happens in that case? How then do we move the conversation? We need to move beyond conversation, but how do we move the conversation forward into, it doesn't matter whether or not, it's clear, because as you say, some of the documentation was destroyed, and in other cases there was no documentation. These things were meant to go and not return. So Lydia, perhaps speak a little bit on that. I know it's a very long question.
Oh, I feel sorry for myself. Now, as she said, it's a simple matter of justice. If I have something, you use the sweater. If it is not mine, what am I doing with it? I should give it back to the owner. And you see, this question is a bit more emotive than just a sweater. Because what we're talking about is a people's culture, cultural heritage. Let me give a very simplistic example. Imagine if we took the shield of Koitalel Arab Samoei. He led the Nandi. So if you come and take his shield, and probably you take it to the British Museum and keep it there. Now, ordinarily, the way a museum operates, you're not just placing the artifacts there to be looked at, to be seen, and that is it. No, that's insulting to the people. What you want to provoke is a conversation, is a narrative between the viewer and the object. So the people who go to the British Museum, when they look at objects from the Nandi community, half of them don't know who these Nandi are. They don't have a clue. Koitele used to say
Koita what?
Yes, that's what they'll ask you. So eventually, if we can just skip to the end of that story, you're telling the story of how great and grand the British Empire was. We went, we colonized, we even collected trophies. This guy was just bothering us, so he asked Colonel William Tagen, can you come? I don't know why somebody with such a German name was working for the King's African Rifles, but you're telling him, can you come and put this Nandi business, just finish it once and for all. So you go away with it, your only intention, correct me if I'm wrong, is to simply tell the rest of the world how mighty and how great and how, the colonial power was. And you know what? The empire is finished. You cannot sustain that story because from 1945, after the Second World War, the British Empire started exiting center stage. Why are you going to sustain a narrative that has been passed by time? Anyway, we can simply wait and see what happens in the next 20 years, but it become irrelevant. But let's come back to Koitalel Arab Samoei. The shield was his. Imagine if you brought back that shield, don't even put it in Nairobi National Museum, take it back to the Nandi. You know what? Like every other human being, he has a family, he has descendants. Where his sons and his daughters and their children, they would be so proud. They would feel complete to have the shield of their grandfather. Whether he was beaten by the British or not, that's not the point. For them, the shield of their grandfather is a part of who they are. So for somebody to sit in a museum, to be in charge of a government telling me there's provenance, there's no provenance, we can't tell, all those are stories. Just cut it short. I mean, who does it belong to? If it belongs to Koitalel Arab Samoei, it should be where Koitalel Arab Samoei is. And apart from the narratives that are attached to those artifacts, apart from them being overtaken by time, they can also be false. Because if the only thing you can do is tell me that Koitalel was beaten by the British, is that all there is to say about the man? I mean, that's a very simplistic way of looking at things. There's a lot more that made Koitalel who he was. If you remove an artifact from its context, you're beginning to distort the story. It is not possible to collect the whole of the different Kenyan communities and deposit them in Britain or in France. It's just not doable. We can talk papers, we can say diplomatic this or the other, but that is neither here nor there. Once those artifacts come back to the people they belong to, the story will be enriched. The conversation will have substance. It will no longer be, they've come to the museum, I'm the tour guide, I need to tell them, what did you say this shield was from? What was that name again? It's a fabricated story. But if it's here, and mind you, one of the reasons why some people don't want the artifacts to come back to Africa, they actually very paternalistically say, the Africans may not look after their own heritage well. I mean, their words I can't even repeat. I can't say them loudly. It's an insult. There isn't another way of saying it. So, give them back to us. Whether we want to put them in a museum or to put them in the cowshed, that's our business. If she brings back the sweater, whatever she does with it, she might use it to mop the floor in her house. That's up to her. Because again, she mentioned something very interesting, thanks for that, Dr. that it's a question of being the same. If we all have the same humanity, we are all equal human beings, then why should I keep your heritage? It belongs to you, it's yours. What am I doing with it? That can only happen if, for some reason, I assume that Dr. here is subhuman. That way she will not be able to look after her own heritage. She will not even understand it. You know, she really doesn't have the ability to know who she is or to negotiate that relationship between herself and her grandfather and her peoples. It's a very emotive subject, and I'd rather not go into greater detail because it just beats me. The lack of logic. Yeah.
Okay, so you have spoken about objects, and you've actually mentioned the shield of Koitalel Arab Samoei. And Doc, you spoke about documents. We'll come back to something that is actually in the first section of this issue. But for you, I would like to focus a little bit on the museum because they've mentioned that in what they've been saying. So if you speak to some people who are asking for their objects back, they would wish for these objects to end up at the museum because it becomes a central point for the stories which were lost. Because one of the things that happened when these objects were taken is that the stories that they carried with them, the stories they embodied got lost. So they would want these objects to end up in the museum. And in this case, I'm referencing the spear of Karambu Olesenteu, where one of his descendants says, it's okay if it comes to the museum, because then Kenyans don't know the story about how the Maasai actually stood up to the colonialists. So it would be nice for that shield and the spear to end up at the museum so that everybody can have access to that story. On the other hand, we also know that museums are in many cases and in many contexts colonial libraries with that colonial baggage. So my question to you then would be, how do we begin to decolonize the museum, and what would be the new, or maybe the, I don't know, new or advanced positionality of the museum in the conversation around restitution, so that we are not bringing these objects back to come and replicate the same power structure here on the continent or in our countries? Yeah.
Thank you very much. You've asked me a very complex question, and I will try to tackle it. Let me say this, that the two scenarios, we've talked about as one scenario of the Maasai spear that should come back to the museum. But I also want to point out that we do have a scenario where communities are very particular about their objects not coming to the museum at all.
Exactly.
And I'll give a case of the Bokomo drum. The Bokomo drum, which was the power, or is the power structure, everything, it has the spirit of the Bokomo people, is something that I even would not want to touch. I wouldn't even want to see it. I am a museum professional and I wouldn't want it in my store. I'm not saying this because it is bad, but it's because I believe that an object is not just an object, and I want to give this analogy. And I want to talk about Prof and your shirt. What is the difference between that shirt now and when you bought it? Is it the same?
Clearly not the same.
Exactly. Exactly. Because that shirt now has the scent of Prof.
Absolutely.
It carries Prof around. So at times when I see it, I'll see Prof. I am using him because I've never seen him again. Let's just say that I'm saying he wears the same shirt all the time. But that's exactly what I'm talking about, that an object is not just an object. It has a soul. It has a story. It has something else that is beyond the physical. So when I talk about some objects, and some of these that I even would not even feel like it's okay to call them objects, they are so sacred that they even scare me as a museum practitioner. So look at those two scenarios. So what I'm talking about and what you've asked me is a very important question. And let me say this, that even as the National Museums of Kenya, we are not saying that we are fully decolonized. We we are saying that we are working towards that decolonization. It's important because you know how we've been founded in our history. We have our colonial background with us. We have this that we have always inherited, and something that we need to work on. That is why we still have our bureaucracy. We have borrowed this here, we borrowed that here. But actually, the museum we are talking about, the decolonized or the new museum, is a museum that can negotiate with Prof and ask him. I have this shirt that I found. I don't know how it was lost. I found it. What would you like me to do? This is the museum we are talking about. The museum that allows the voices of people to come out. A museum that invests in making sure that they know exactly what the community would want with their objects. A museum that is so open-minded to a point of looking like it is almost not functional. You know what I mean? Is when my colleague here talks about letting people throw their spear in whatever, in dam or whatever they want to do it. And it is so important because he could have the shirt and I would think it's really nice, it's precious, I found it for you. But do I know whether he still looks at it the same way? Maybe it is not potent anymore. I'm using potent because when we are talking about objects, some of them are so potent. We are talking about ritual objects. We are talking about sacred objects. Just like I wouldn't pick any kind of crucifix from a church and start doing whatever I can do with it because I know it means something to somebody. The same I would want to see the museum treat objects. And by this I mean it has to go as far as even looking at who handles these objects. Are they qualified? If an object is not supposed to be handled by somebody who is not circumcised, who am I to even get near it? Can we respect that objects are not just physical? So for me, that is my pledge and that's my prayer. I don't know whether I'll be there to see that kind of a museum. I do not know whether it will be there in this time, but what I'm saying is that this is exactly what we are looking forward to. And maybe it's going a little bit back to a question that has been discussed by my friend, if you allow me.
Yes.
We are talking about a thief. Let me just use a thief. Mwizi in Kiswahili. A thief.
Moishi.
Moishi, this is in my language. It is a very serious issue that I steal, and it's as if that is not enough. I erase anything that can connect me with that kind of theft. What is worse? So if you tell me that the provenance of something cannot be found, then what are you saying? I think I'm a worse criminal. So if you have done something that can make an object not even traceable, I think you ought to be punished more. Because it means you have not only committed one crime, you've added another one onto it. Because I don't think there's anything in this world, even when we are talking about IP issues, intellectual property, nothing guarantees. If you paid me to be here this afternoon, I've not been paid by the way. If you paid me to be here this afternoon, and you took something and used it against me, there's something I don't lose, my moral rights. I am a human being. So can we recognize this and think about this as if, you know, wear that shoe of the person who is thinking about how a whole community lost its power structure because somebody thought it was not necessary. I want